This show is made possible by Apple Podcasts, Squarespace, The Wild Man's Press, and available wherever you get your podcasts, and by the generous contributions of subscribers like you. Thank you for reviewing, sharing, and subscribing. Covering in-depth interviews and dialogues with paranormal researchers, investigators, and authors, the Phenomena Case Files podcast would love to hear from you. If you'd like to be on the show to discuss your topic of expertise or fieldwork with our listeners, please go to our website, phenomenacasefiles.com, sign up or email the show. If you think you've experienced an unexplained event, maybe brushed against the paranormal, and would like to share your story, contact us at phenomenacasefiles@gmail.com. Please add the keywords Listener Case File X to the subject line of your email to pass through the show's strict communication filters. And finally, enjoy tonight's show.
Cities never sleep, but neither do the creatures that might hide in their shadows. From the towering skyscrapers of New York to the winding alleyways of London, there are whispers, stories of beings who walk among us, unseen, unnoticed. They are the Night Stalkers, the urban legends, the modern-day vampires. But are they just myths, or could they be real? Welcome to Urban Vampires. Do Night Stalkers lurk in modern cities? I'm your host, Robert Cavalier, and tonight we're diving into the dark heart of the urban landscape to uncover the truth behind one of the most enduring legends of all time, the vampire. Vampires have haunted our imaginations for centuries, from the bloodthirsty Count Dracula to the brooding immortals of modern pop culture. They've always been a symbol of our deepest fears and desires. But what if they're not just characters in books or movies? What if they're out there, right now, blending into the crowds, hiding in plain sight? Tonight we'll explore the chilling possibility that vampires aren't just creatures of folklore. They could be living among us in the very cities we call home. But before we go any further, let's set the stage. Imagine this. It's midnight in a sprawling metropolis. The streets are alive with the hum of traffic, the glow of neon signs, the murmur of late-night crowds. But in the shadows, something stirs. A figure moves silently, watching, waiting. Pale skin, sharp features, eyes that seem to pierce the darkness. Is it just your imagination, or is it something else? This isn't just a scene from a horror movie. It's a reality that some people claim to have experienced. From the Highgate Vampire of London to the rumored Manhattan Vampire Clan, urban legends about vampires have persisted for decades. And then there are the real live vampire communities. People who identify as vampires, who drink blood or feed on energy, and who live hidden lives in the heart of our cities. But why cities? Why do these stories thrive in the urban jungle? Well, think about it. Cities are places of anonymity, of constant movement. In a crowd of millions, it's easy to disappear, to go unnoticed. And in a city that never sleeps, the night is always alive, perfect for creatures of the dark. Over the next hour, we'll hear from experts, researchers, and even members of the vampire subculture. We'll delve into eyewitness accounts of vampire-like figures stalking the streets. We'll explore the history of vampire legends and how they've evolved to fit the modern world. And we'll ask the question, are these stories just urban myths, or is there something more to them? But before we go any further, let me point you to this. In 1970, London was gripped by a wave of vampire hysteria. People reported seeing a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes lurking in Highgate Cemetery. Vampire hunters patrolled the graves, armed with stakes and holy water. And while the panic eventually faded, the legend of the Highgate Vampire lives on. Was it mass hysteria, a clever hoax, or was there something or someone real behind the stories? Tonight we'll uncover the truth behind the legends. We'll hear from those who claim to have encountered vampires in the modern world. We'll explore the philosophy, the psychology, and the cultural significance of these stories. And we'll ask, could vampires really be lurking in our cities? So grab your headphones, turn down the lights, and join me as we step to the shadows. Because in the world of Night Stalkers, the line between myth and reality is razor thin. Welcome back to the Phenomena Case Files podcast, and tonight I'm excited to dive right into this vampire subject. I've been really wanting to do an episode like this. It's been in the works for a while, and we're going to talk about real vampires. Do they exist in an urban setting, modern day cities? But let's get a little bit of background before we dive into that aspect, which is going to be the meat of the episode, and look into a little bit of the background of vampires, of vampirism. And as we all know, we associate them, vampires, with the Slavic, Eastern European lore, which of course is really interesting. And the word, I looked it up, it does originate from there. There are other possibilities, Greek, Turkish, but nobody can be really sure about where the stories really originated, where that word really originated. It's important because it leads us to where did it all start. And indeed, in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, there was a peak of these stories. You could call it the vampire hysteria epoch, as some of the researchers that I've bumped into have dubbed it. And even before that, it's predated. In fact, it's predated by thousands of years, all the way to the Babylonians, the Egyptians. Even the Indians have this vampire lore. And I'm not going to get into that aspect as much, even though it is exciting. Maybe we'll do that a little later on. But for now, I really want to look at how these mythical figures, or these legends, these really just horror stories of a long time ago, seeped into our modern world. And of course, we know that happened through fiction, most famously Dracula, and other novels, and just there's a plethora, there's an abundance of things to draw on. But it is thought that vampires, first, when we were less situated in cities and most of the world was really rural, that those stories, those legends had a more rural beginning. In other words, there were these vampires stalking victims at night in villages, and the famous scenes come to mind of villagers with pitchforks and so on. And that's where it came from. And as time went by and more people moved into cities, city becoming more and more the focus of daily living, so did vampires. And we start seeing that, especially in the 18th century. We start seeing, and that's really when we're talking about, well, the 1700s, and then really moving into the 1800s, which is the 19th century, when Industrial Revolution was really kicking up. We see these bigger cities supporting a bigger population, and so did these stories that they brought from their villages. Or we could look at it another way. If this is real, and if you think this is real, and that's what we're going to dive into and talk about, vampires maybe just followed people into a better place, a better setting to stalk, to hide in plain sight. Some of the things I want to overview are the Highgate Vampire of London, the Manhattan Vampire Clan, the Chicago Vampire Scene, and the Parisian Night Stalker. I may only cover the first couple of these and really just highlight the Highgate Vampire, because that is one of the latest and most modern accounts that I was able to find. I'm interested in city accounts in particular because that's where most of us live, and I'm just really interested to know if anybody has seen a vampire in modern days, especially, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, all of these years where we have been so focused on these metropolis, New York City. I was really hoping to find those stories. I found other sources, and I'm hoping still to have some stories come in. Cities are a magnet for all kinds of commerce and enterprise and people of all walks of life looking for opportunities to prosper. According to an article on timeout.com, New York City is the best city for vampires. This is a fun little article, and I'd like to just highlight it before we head into more serious grounds. And the article even, of course it's tongue-in-cheek. It goes into the statistics and the criteria of why New York City would be the optimal place for a vampire to live in, followed by Chicago, and I agree with that. I think Chicago would be great. Seattle is number 13, so there's about 13 cities, and there's a map on the website on timeout.com of this fun little article, which if you get a visual of the U.S., you see that the top sites are pretty much the eastern board right there by the latitude of New York and neighboring states like Pennsylvania, D.C., and other places, and then Chicago. And then as you move far west, you don't see as many, although I was surprised to see some in the southwest that ranked higher than I would have expected given the warmer climate and the more sunlight, the sunnier. And so that's a fun thing. It says here that the worst cities for vampires are, number one, surprise, Arizona. Actually, Arizona just takes the first about 6 or 7 slots, then Nevada, and then Lancaster, California, Huntington Beach, California. It doesn't mention L.A., but I think L.A. would be a good place for vampires. What do you think? And the best, going back to the best, not just New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. L.A. is listed as number 4, so I take it back. They did look at that. San Francisco. We'll talk about a little bit of San Francisco because that reminds me of a series that took place there, an old TV show. And then Pittsburgh, and then Baltimore, somewhere there. Baltimore should have been higher too, right? With Edgar Allan Poe lore and all of that. Well, the criteria is fun, and won't spend too much time on it, but, the cities that have the most blood centers, the fewest blood centers, well, that's not as optimal. So it kind of goes in like most casket suppliers, fewest casket suppliers, highest share of homes with basements. I'm not sure why that's important. I guess that's where you would put a basket. So it's kind of got like an infographic that you look at. And if you're a vampire, you might make your decisions based on this. Nightlife options are going to be great in New York, Chicago, Las Vegas, all these kinds of places. I don't think Las Vegas would be good for a vampire. It's too hot. But who knows? Maybe they can hide in plain sight. We'll talk about that. That is a little bit silly. Even the article says here, while this might be silly to you, New York City has some history with vampires. And in the 1870s, people used to drink blood collected from slaughterhouses, especially one on 34th Street by the Hudson River. They drink cups of blood collected straight from the necks of freshly slaughtered steers. They believed the blood could treat all kinds of diseases. Wow, that's a little nugget among all this, fun thing. But I cannot fathom people actually thinking that this would have a therapeutic benefit to them. Pretty gross. So cities are, moving on from the tongue-in-cheek and the fun of that article, if you think about it in logistical terms, cities would provide the perfect cover for vampires. There's an anonymity there as a city dweller. The darkness, the constant movement, the way in which city dwellers, including myself, are usually distracted with something else. We have somewhere to go. We don't want to talk to anybody. We want to just be in our own little world, reading a book or on our phones or listening to music or pretending we just don't notice people, but we actually do notice them. We look at them and we observe. That's the fun part about living in a city, right? Watching people. What are they doing? And judging them, right? Judging them. So maybe there's a vampire judging us. and I think they would, right? Like, what are these people doing? And I think that those logistical aspects of a real vampire, not the mythical, not the Hollywood, but the real deal, would likely look at a city as a perfect place to hide in plain sight. But this brings me to, I touched upon a little bit on a series that I remembered, and I'm kind of just excited about talking about this. This whole thing is just a preface for me to talk about some geeky stuff from the past. I remember a show that's based on, some people might know this one, it's based on a role-playing game that I never played or knew about back then. This was this show was called Kindred the Embraced. Okay, it came out in 1996, and I believe it was on Fox, I'm pretty sure, and it ran for 8 episodes, and the 9th was never shown. So it got canceled really fast. But it was a really, really good show. I was kind of a kid back then, pretty young, and I got sucked into it. I loved it. I loved the way some factions were presented. These are city-dwelling modern vampires. That's the premise. But they have figured out how to live among people, and with the benefits of being immortal, even if you live just 150 years, you could accumulate quite a bit of wealth, okay? And if you did that across time and develop some kind of clan system, some kind of secret society, even some modern investments, some land acquisition, you could buy land really cheap in, say, San Francisco in the 1800s, and then turn around 100 years later and it's just worth millions and millions. So not that hard to get rich if you make some conventional choices along the way and if you live a very long time. The trick then is, how do you hide all of that? How do you hide the fact that you're not aging, you're not dying, and you're living way past your years? So in this show, it's based on about 5 factions, and they're called, Toreador and so forth. I'll go into it a little bit more. Maybe I loved it because each faction has its own characteristics, and each faction has an agreement, or a truce of nonviolence at the minimum. Say like the Nosferatu, which are under city dwellers, and they can't really go and have the benefit of, say, like the Toreadors or something, which are more artistic, and they don't have the stigma or the disadvantage of looking really disfigured. I don't know if I would call Nosferatu disfigured, but they have these long ears, this bald head, this gray skin, these long fangs. Picture the famous 1920s silent movie Nosferatu, and that's what they look like in the show. Okay, so I'm still talking about the show, but I like the show because the show is based on, and I learned this way later, on a role-playing game in which all these factions have to, compete or collaborate or ally or fight each other to some degree. The series starts with a detective that, because of it's the pilot, and he becomes aware that vampires are real. These are real vampires, and then he gets sucked into their society as he investigates a little bit more. And there's a beautiful woman in there, a beautiful actress in there too, who gets involved with one of the main vampires. The big criticism of the way that the show was deployed was that people compared it to kind of the Godfather of vampirism, and it just I didn't think that it was bad, and they could have maybe done it a little bit better. It wasn't like, it was a bit like a mafia system, but it makes sense for vampires to have a secret society, like I said before, and to accumulate wealth and to figure out a way to coexist first among themselves with really strict rules that they must enforce, such as there are rules of who gets to increase their numbers in their clan or their faction by adding a new member, who gets to do that and under what circumstances, and it's strictly something that needs to be agreed upon. And so it's a bit like a guild system. It's a lot like that, actually. And it makes sense just in the economics of it, and it makes sense also because you would have a small circle of friends that, in the show, for instance, they own, nightclubs and restaurants, and, they have a lot of wealth. Doing that is the ultimate protection. Money is the probably the greatest power that we at least humans could at least touch upon in our limited lives. And if you're an immortal, then that really sort of doubles up, because then yes, you could be exclusive. You don't have to be front facing with people. Your group of people that would be small enough, because you don't have to have, unless you're really not a well-performing vampire or something, I don't know, a day job. Obviously you couldn't because you're a vampire, but if you wouldn't have to have an office job, you would have to just make sure that you stay within the confines of certain behaviors that are expected from you, and survive that way and persist at least, for a long time, really. And especially in a city, people don't really delve into other people's business as much. In a city like New York City, that should be easier. And if you're just interacting with people that are mostly vampires, and maybe some people that are not, that come in and out, that's not hard to pull off. And that logistical part of the series I liked a lot. I know I'm talking a lot about it, but it's just exciting. And it was exciting back then. And as it turned out, the public was not really that ready, even though I think it was growing. The actual thing that got the show canceled was that the lead actor, he actually died in a motorcycle accident. He was a cool guy and whatnot, and he died in a car accident, so they couldn't go forward. I think they could have still gone forward without him. I mean, he was all right, but they didn't, and that was the end. I've always wanted to know if the ninth episode is somewhere. I actually own the DVD miniseries collection of that from way back in the day. It's probably 20-something years old. When it first came out, I said, I'm going to get this, and I got it, and it's probably worth a lot more now, because that's how things go. But I as I said, it's based on this Masquerade game, Vampire the Masquerade game, which I've gotten a chance to actually observe. I was taking an English course a while back, a literature course a while back, and I got to know really cool types, and they were all into all different kinds of things. And one of them invited me to a Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game that I'd never seen, because we got to talking about vampires, and as it turns out, and I may have him on later on, he writes vampire fiction, and so the game is really cool, and it takes a long time, and it's a great way to delve into this culture. And you can go to theworldofdarkness.com, and it has been revamped. It's not the old Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game, but it's got more factions. I believe there's 13, and each one of them has a corresponding, each clan then has a corresponding book. I'm not going to judge. It's a little bit pulpy, but it's all right. And it goes into each and every clan's lore, and it kind of weaves a big story out of these 13 series books. There's 13 in the series because there's 13 clans. And then it got revamped into what it is now. I think they made a video game of it, and it's considered sort of like a flawed gem, because it's, people that are in this subcultures of gaming and role-playing games, they really appreciate things that come new, but sometimes they're not completely workable. In its most recent iteration, it looks to me amazing. I don't have time to really delve into a lot of these things as I'm preparing for these shows and writing myself and doing all sorts of things. But man, if you do have a chance to get into that, or want a new hobby, I think that would be a great way to meet new people, because they do it in person, and that's a great way. You have a few beers, you play, and you get to participate and dive into this lore and create lore. They're creating a story as they go along based on the parameters of the game. But having said that, I wanted to look seriously at vampirism, and that takes us to some very different grounds. Because if vampires are real, then we have to start to begin to understand them as any real ecological phenomena, as something that exists just like anything else, that has its own prerogatives, its own reason, its own motivations, and they may be in fact they should be or would be very, very different than yours and mine. Their style of survival and their style of living will be completely different. And you always think, as a person, as a mortal, as a mere mortal, well, wouldn't it be nice to live a long, long, long life, say hundreds of years? But even if you're already just middle-aged or somewhere along the line, you have to think, how and at what point do things just become repetitive? How does it, how do you keep alive the impetus for living? Of course, in the lore of vampirism, that kind of living that they're doing is really not living, but it's almost like a cursed kind of a living. It's tied to the need to feed and to, in some cases, become so isolated that any remnant of humanity becomes more and more vanishing as time goes by. And you could imagine all kinds of mental health challenges and problems emanating and just exacerbating, becoming even more troublesome. The mind of a vampire that's, say, 300 or 500 years old versus one that's 150 might be very, very different. Two very different generations, and the definition of generations even being completely turned upside down if they do interact with each other in some kind of basis, as they do in this, sort of a thought experiment or a game of Vampire the Masquerades, or if they exist now, what kind of lives do they live? Are they isolated? Do some choose to, as a way to survive, do some choose to just go it alone and have a very small amount of friends? Or do some become involved with humans, have friendships, develop them, lose them, have to walk out on them at some point because otherwise they'll be privy to the fact that they're not aging? And that's a premise of another show, Highlander, which is not about a vampire, but it's also delving into these ideas of immortality and the pain of in the show it was a show too, and then before it was of course a movie with Christopher Lambert as a Scotsman, a Frenchman as a Scotsman. Well, it was the 80s, and I loved it. But you start to look at this, and it becomes this very interesting thought experiment. What is the feasibility of a creature like that actually existing, actually lurking, and what kind of strategies is it deploying to survive, to make it among us, and to figure out its own existence? Very often we think about vampires, especially nowadays, more as a tragic figure, a somewhat romantic figure, a figure at conflict with itself, an anti-hero. And Carl Jung might have referred to them as not an archetype, but a subset of an archetype, something like emanating from the shadow people, the shadow man. It's something that represents an archetype of darkness, of conflict, of evil, of dissent. And as we've lived with these stories, we've also changed them, and we have to wonder: have we changed them because fiction changes and our attitudes change, and that's just the way it goes, or is it based on something real? Are we experiencing anything in the modern age that we could approximate to that? So I want to take you to some very interesting tidbits that I found, some clips, and regarding first witness accounts, because that's what I really wanted to find. And the first one, actually all the clips are related to the first event that I mentioned earlier, and that was the Highgate of London. That was a cemetery. It was back in the late 60s, right around 69. And I'll preface by saying that this was an event that was very well documented, although the sources of how it was documented and what started everything going, we'll get into that too, because there's a little bit of perhaps showmanship, perhaps hysteria, and perhaps real accounts. One of those accounts comes from a young man named David Farrant. And David was a local young man who was drawn to the paranormal at the time, and it's late 1969 when he starts hearing whispers about strange beings at the cemetery, strange sightings. On one of those occasions, he claims to have bumped into two people. I don't know at which times. It looks like he had interviewed them because he was investigating. And the first account of that is from an older lady, and this is David Ferrand recounting that. To set the stage a little bit, before I get to the clip, the cemetery had actually served pretty well-off people since about the 1800s or earlier. It's a really beautiful cemetery, and it was even more in its heyday, containing elaborate mausoleums, huge statues of angels, tall trees, well taken care of gardens. But by the time David Ferrand makes his way there, in the 1960s and late 1960s, even before that, it had fallen into disarray, and it was known that it had been trespassed and subject to some vandalism, and some graves had even been disturbed. There were also rumors of rites or secret rites carried out by different groups. So at that time, I found some footage of David Ferrand retelling this account, and it's a bit rough, so bear with me, and let's listen in now.
I am David Ferrand, a psychic investigator, and over 20 years ago I began an investigation into what was one of the most chilling accounts of vampirism in the 20th century. The case of the Highgate Vampire, circulating about a tall, dark figure that had been seen in and around Highgate Cemetery. It invariably took the shape of a tall figure, and many witnesses described it as wearing a cloak. Apart from this, many people remarked on its eyes. One old lady that I interviewed personally in 1969, for example, was walking her dog up Swains Lane late at night. And suddenly, when she reached the main gate, the dog suddenly stopped and refused to go any further. It whined and it turned around and it tried to retreat. At this moment, the old lady looked up, and just inside the main gate, she described a tall, dark figure with glaring red eyes, which seemed to be floating towards her. Obviously, she didn't stay much longer than that, and she quickly went back down Swains Lane with her dog. She also told me that the surrounding area had turned icy cold.
The first account is very brief and atmospheric, but there's that important detail, if you noticed, toward the end, of the temperature plummeting. Let's keep that in mind as we move on to the second account. And this is about a man who had also wandered into the vicinity of the cemetery. Here again, David Ferrand, in his own words.
Then again, there was the case of a 45-year-old accountant who I referred to as Thornton because he asked for his correct name to be withheld. And he had gone into Highgate Cemetery at around this time, really just to look around. It was a late afternoon, and at that time, Highgate Cemetery was open to the public. Unfortunately, perhaps for Thornton, he became hopelessly lost, and he couldn't find his way back to the main path. He was quite near the large circle of tombs in the middle of the cemetery known as the Columbarium, and he heard the bell go, and so he thought the best thing to do was just to make his way towards the sound of the bell at the main gate and find his way out that way. All of a sudden, Thornton became aware of something behind him. At this stage, he didn't know exactly what it was, but he had an overwhelming sense that someone was watching him. And again, he noticed that the temperature in the surrounding area had dropped quite considerably. He swung around, and he described a tall, dark figure, which was looking at him with intensity. He told me that it was almost as if this figure was trying to hypnotize him. In any event, he seemed to be losing control of his normal faculties. At this point, without warning, the figure suddenly vanished. And Thornton stumbled around in the cemetery, and eventually he found the main path, and he never returned.
Notice the details in the second account. It gets much more physiological, the impact, the atmosphere, the plummeting of the temperature. All of these are interesting, and they come about in different accounts of encounters with the paranormal. Well, David Farrant is retelling this many years later, and there's reenactment of the sounds and so forth. It's pretty choppy, and I appreciate you listening to that. It's important because it's very rare to get an account of a vampire sighting. I looked and looked and looked, and even people I thought would make up something and tell and share their dubious accounts, there weren't many. There's a lot of sightings of ghosts, cryptids, and all kinds of things, but vampires are a hard find. So these accounts, if true, are really a gem and really unique, and we need to pay attention to what they're sharing. If there's anything to find out about these, the urban vampire is really a very, very mystical and very, very cunning creature that, because of its intelligence, knows how to hide well among people. This one seems to be a little bit different. I want you to pay attention to the details that Farrant shares about him, because it's not as though he's trying to hide this sighting. There's a very eerie and very intense predatory feeling to the whole thing. So Farrant, again a young impetuous man at the time and interested in the paranormal, decides to do his own investigation, and he spends the night at the cemetery. This is Farrant in his own words.
I suspected it could have been maybe a large animal which descriptions are distorted. I even suspected that it could have been some very human person dressed up with the intention of frightening people. Whatever, it was around midnight, late in '69, and as I passed the top gate of Highgate Cemetery, I became aware. I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. And I looked up, or rather I looked around, and I saw a tall figure. It must have been about 7 feet tall. I couldn't tell, but it's almost as if it was floating just above the ground. But I distinctly saw its face, or rather, I saw 2 points of intense red light, which I took to be its eyes. At first, it was so real that at first I thought it was somebody dressed up as a vampire. But the area turned icy cold. It was almost as if you had stepped into a refrigerator. more important still, the figure, or whatever it was, seemed to be draining me of energy. I, too, seemed to be losing control of my normal faculties. The best way I can describe it is if I was living a vivid dream, and I wanted to wake up, but I could not. Realizing I was under intense psychic attack, I mentally repeated a Kabbalistic incantation, which is used to repel potent evil forces. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was no longer there. It was after my sighting of the figure that I decided that the reports were indeed true. And we decided, that is, members of the British Psychic and Occult Society, decided to launch a full-scale investigation.
It's a remarkable retelling of his own experience, and it's also notable because he shares a defense that he deployed when he felt he was under psychic attack. Well, if this is true, there's a way to fight back. But David Farrant was so shaken up by this experience that he felt compelled to share the details of his experience, even against the, for sure, negative attention and stigma that might follow him, especially back in those days. What became known as the Highgate Vampire, David Castleton, in an article, tells us that in February 1970, Farrant wrote a letter to a local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, also known as the Ham and High, asking if anyone had seen anything similar. A number of people responded saying they had glimpsed apparitions in Highgate Cemetery and Swains Lane. These phantoms, though, were of a variety of descriptions, including a tall man wearing a hat, a ghostly cyclist, a lady dressed in white, a face grimacing through the bars of a gate, a person wading into a pond, and a gale-gliding entity. There were also reports of the sounds of bells and voices calling. There was little coherence in the types of specters people claimed to have seen, but another local young man with an interest in the supernatural, Sean Manchester, was intrigued by what he read, and this is important because it sets forth a whole host of cause and effect that converges upon the Highgate Cemetery. So, Manchester would soon make public his ideas about what he thought that apparition in the graveyard might be. And thus was born, I think, at that time, the legend of the Highgate Vampire. Though Farrant had never claimed the dark figure he'd encountered was a vampire, Sean Manchester had little doubt that a genuine Nosferatu was stalking suburban North London. Manchester contacted the Ham and High, and on 27th February 1970, the newspaper published an interview entitled "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?", in which Manchester outlined a theory to explain the monster's presence. Manchester alleged that a king vampire of the undead was buried in the graveyard. This vampire, who in life had been an aristocrat and practitioner of black magic in medieval Romania, had been transported to England in a coffin by his followers in the early 18th century. The vampire had been interred on the site that would later become Highgate Cemetery, and his followers had also purchased a house for him in London's fashionable West End. The reason for the Highgate Vampire's reappearance, Manchester said, was that rituals recently carried out by Satanists in the cemetery had reawakened this evil presence. Manchester claimed to have spoken to local people who'd experienced vampiric activity. A schoolgirl, Elizabeth Wadila, had seen the vampire when walking down Swains Lane. Wadila began having nightmares in which something evil tried to come into her bedroom. Eventually, 2 wounds appeared on her neck, and she started to display symptoms of anemia. Manchester and Elizabeth's boyfriend filled her room with garlic, crucifixes, and holy water, and soon her condition improved. Manchester spoke to another young woman called Jacqueline, who said she'd woken in the night to find something cold clutching her hand. The next morning, she noticed deep tears in the flesh where she tried to force her hand free. Jacqueline and her younger brother soon developed a fascination that kept drawing them to the more dilapidated western side of Highgate Cemetery, where Manchester suspected the vampiric infection had occurred. Manchester claimed that after details about the Highgate Vampire became public, more people contacted him, all describing a similar tall, dark being with blazing eyes. So we have to ask, could there have been any truth to the claims about occult rituals at Highgate Cemetery? Because that was part of what was going on then. Many things, many different phenomena, some just people enacted, were converging upon this graveyard, if you recall, even years before this. And the cemetery, though at one point very, very well taken care of, had become dilapidated. There was graffiti. There were mausoleums that were disturbed and graveyards that were disturbed. But Manchester, remember Manchester, it's another young man, interestingly enough, takes over the original account by Ferrand, and he himself sort of propels the story forward. In an interview, Manchester didn't supply any proof to back up his ideas about the vampire coming from Eastern Europe. He would later state this part of the article was a journalistic embellishment, but in a book he published in 1985, The Highgate Vampire, Manchester does mention a foreign nobleman's coffin being brought to Highgate. There, however, appears to be more solid evidence concerning the occult ceremonies Manchester believed were taking place in the graveyard. Farron said that in Highgate Cemetery he often found the discarded remains of Satanist rituals, stubs of black candles, satanic markings on the floor, tombs. In one small chapel-like tomb with a marble floor and stained glass windows, an inverted pentagram had been drawn on the floor. Like Manchester, Ferrand felt such activities might have woken a long-dormant presence. Ferrand claimed his research showed that though the dark figure had not been glimpsed for many years before the rash of sightings in the 60s and 70s, people had seen a similar entity in the Victorian epoch. According to Manchester, the police were well aware of black magic practices going on in the cemetery. It's worth pointing out that Ferrand himself was a member of a group that used to do rituals in the cemetery, though they were believed to be pagan Wicca ones rather than anything satanic. Ferrand stated that his group never interfered with graves or bodies, but as many of their rituals had been conducted outdoors, they used the cemetery because it was a secluded open space. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw a revival of interest in all aspects of mysticism and the occult, including paganism, Eastern mysticism, Satanism, witchcraft, and the teaching of Aleister Crowley, as well as the emergence of a number of less conventional Christian sects. It's clear that an overgrown and secluded place like Highgate Cemetery could offer those engaged in the more outlandish aspects of this resurgence a suitable atmospheric space to carry out their ceremonies. But little concerning the Highgate Vampire was likely to stay secluded for long. That is because the Hampstead and Highgate Express continued to follow the vampire story, re-interviewing Ferrand and Manchester several times over the next months. In an article published on 6th of March, 1970, Ferrand said he'd found dead foxes in the cemetery but couldn't work out how they died, though he thought a vampire might have been responsible. So there, he's just offering speculation. This is carrying on months and months, so the newspaper is getting a little bit of juice out of this. And rightly so, if this is, like I said, a true account and corroborated by a few witnesses, and on top of that, a very, very rare thing to see. Not many stories coming forward about urban vampires. I told you I expected a plethora of accounts and found very few. This is why we're focusing so much on this Highgate Vampire. And later on, we'll focus on some other lore and some other real accounts or accounts that have a high fidelity to them. And that could be coming in a second part to this Urban Vampires segment, or not segment, but follow-up or sequel of the series. But back to what was happening at this Highgate Cemetery. Manchester had claimed he'd also seen the foxes and suggested the vampire may have been using them as a food source. So if we have a vampire that's feeding on wildlife, it seems to me that it's a vampire that's doing its best to avoid hurting people. And then when he encounters them, as he did with Ferrand, which obviously didn't result in a fatality, nor did it with the other two, the old lady and the accountant, or the man dubbed the accountant. So there's a reason to think, or could we ask, maybe he's just this vampire, this entity, if he was even a vampire, because he's described as 7 foot tall, and I've never heard of a vampire being described as such a gigantic figure. Then again, this could be some shape-shifting or some mental capacity, some way to make someone believe that something's so much bigger, much in the way that animals or cats make their bodies big. Could an entity like a supernatural vampire at sometimes just as a defense mechanism just make himself look much bigger? 7 foot tall is just gigantic, and it's not easy to hide or hide in plain sight. Being 7 foot tall, it doesn't behoove you to do that. If he really was 7 foot tall, maybe that's why he just haunts around cemeteries and hunting wildlife to make it, because you can't get close enough to people. Either way, soon it was alleged that the animals had been found drained of blood with their throats ripped open. So there's something I like sharing with you about these stories, and that is that there's many signs, and you can make up your mind about what could have happened. And again, keep in mind that these are rare accounts. Reports of the Highgate Vampire commotion soon reached the national and even international media. Articles appeared in the national press, television programs were made by both ITV and the BBC, and even the international news agency Reuters featured the case. So this is really taking off. And the anxiety commensurate to the national attention and now international attention around the Highgate Vampire was part of a growing obsession with such creatures in British society. A number of TV programmers and horror movies had focused on vampires, and I meant to say programs, sorry, I misspoke. And one film in particular, the Hammer horror production Taste the Blood of Dracula, this was in 1970, had actually been shot in Highgate Cemetery, just a year before the Highgate Vampire incidents began. More chillingly, on the night of Halloween 1968, an act of desecration was discovered in nearby Tottenham Park Cemetery. Flowers had been taken from graves and arranged in circles with arrows pointing to a new grave, which was uncovered. A stake had been driven through the coffin lid and into the heart of the corpse. As interest in the Highgate Vampire mounted, a rivalry grew up between David Ferrand and Sean Manchester, with each belittling the other's skills as an exorcist and each stating that he would be the one to expel the specter lurking in Highgate. So here we go. We have all the atmosphere, the whole background, and even a budding competition for paranormal investigators at the time, if you could call them that. They seem to be rather amateur, but interested and at the right place at the right time. So all these distinct forces are now converging on Highgate Cemetery, and it's significant because what comes up next is going to change a lot of the history of this account, and it's going to leave a significant mark in the history of vampire hunting, paranormal investigation for many years to come. Before we head that way, this is a lot to process, so I think we should take a very brief pause. I want to share with you a little bit about what I've been up to, and I've got a very, very brief message to share with you. Listen to that, take a glass of water, and then we'll be right back, because what's coming up after the small message, the most promo of my work, it's going to be pretty big. You're gonna want to hear this.
One man's solitary mission into the mysteries becomes an obsession. Coming this fall, Phenomena. A new novel by Robert Cavalier puts you in the shoes of Julian Carr, a crime reporter turned paranormal investigator who almost loses everything that once mattered to him in his search for the truth in what could be his one last case. Published by the Wild Man's Press. Stay tuned for release news on phenomenacasefiles.com, on X at PhenomenaXFiles, and for advance copies at Amazon and Kindle.
With stories spreading about a vampire, a specter, lurking around Highgate Cemetery and being shared by common people, rumors starting to spread, plus we have these two paranormal investigators, quite young at the time, possibly amateurish, vying for control of the story and competing with one another to be the one that would expel the vampire at Highgate Cemetery. Tensions really started to build, and they built so high that it was actually surprising that what comes next was not anticipated. But let's listen in a little bit more to what David Castleton describes as the final unleashing. The build-up produced this. On the evening of Friday the 13th, March 1970, a program aired on ITV featuring Ferrand, Manchester, and others claiming to have seen supernatural figures around Highgate. As Friday the 13th is an ominous day according to British superstition, this date is often chosen to broadcast programs dealing with the occult. The program even included live outside reporting from Highgate Cemetery. Within 2 hours of the program being shown, hundreds of would-be vampire hunters showed up at Highgate Cemetery, intent on catching the vampire. They began arriving at Highgate in increasing numbers. They surged over the locked gates and walls of the necropolis despite the efforts of police officers to stop them. This is how big it gets. We're talking about a modern-day pitchfork crowd, and you could almost be transported back to the 13th century or something with this. But let's go on. The vampire hunters, many armed with weapons, searched frantically among Victorian tombs. Those interviewed at the scene appeared to genuinely believe in the vampire, saying they were determined to find the monster and put an end to its diabolical actions. The mob caught no vampires that night, though some insisted they'd glimpsed the tall, dark figure. So more anecdotes that we didn't get to collect. I don't think they were interviewed. I will try to see if there's even more to this, individual accounts, people that survived that time. But we still have rumors of rumors, and we have the original accounts that caused the anxiety and terror to certainly become very real among this community. Manchester would later say the Highgate Vampire furor provoked panic and fear and disbelief on a scale which one might anticipate if an alien had landed from outer space. The collective imagination had no defense against what we unearthed back in the late 60s in Highgate. Ferrand, meanwhile, still unconvinced the spooky presence was a Nosferatu, complained that media hysteria and local superstition had turned the Highgate entity into a vampire. I want to give a little bit of props to Ferrand because remember, he never really explicitly claimed, even the accounts, that he had seen a vampire, not at least at that stage. I think many years later, when this has become quite a popular event, he does, I think, lean into the vampire legend quite a bit more. But at that point, at least he has some healthy skepticism. And I like that because when we investigate anything, we should just take what we see and report what we see without drawing a conclusion, because if you remember, I'm adamant about this. A conjecture is based on a cursory observation followed by a conclusion. I saw a silhouette, oh, it must be a vampire. That's not the way we want logically to follow through. So I'll give him props for that. I like that. But going on that Friday the 13th, as the amateur vampire hunters swarmed over the cemetery, Manchester and some companions made their way to the entrance of one particular catacomb. Manchester had previously been there or been led there actually, by a sleepwalking girl who claimed to have been bothered by the Highgate Vampire and had been exhibiting symptoms similar to Elizabeth's. Unable to open the door, the group used a rope to climb down into the catacomb through a window. They found themselves in a vault with several coffins, one of which, a sinister-looking casket made of nearly black wood, didn't seem to fit. Manchester and his companions performed an exorcism with holy water and garlic and sprinkled salt around. A few months later, on August 1st, the charred, decapitated remains of a woman were found near the catacomb. The police suspected this mutilated corpse had been used in a black magic ritual. After this, both Ferrand and Manchester seemed to become more active. Ferrand was apprehended by the police in the churchyard next to the cemetery one night, clutching a crucifix and wooden stake. Ferrand was arrested, but the case against him collapsed when it came to court. Manchester and his followers, meanwhile, were led to a different family vault by a female psychic helper. After forcing open the doors, they found a black coffin similar to the one they'd seen in the catacombs. Manchester, suspecting it had been moved by black magic devotees, levered open the lid. It was only when we discovered in the putrid chamber of that tomb in August 1970 what we did and looked upon the horrific countenance of what was inside, Manchester said, that we had absolute confirmation of what we were dealing with. Manchester wanted to drive a stake through the body, but a member of his entourage persuaded him not to, as interfering with remains was a crime in England. Instead, the group performed a ritual that used 7 crucifixes, 4 white candles, and 7 cups of holy water in a ceremony carried out by 4 men and a woman to banish the spirit of evil or evil presence using the Latin formula. News of the spoken exorcism did indeed bring a sigh of relief to many living in the area. I'd like to note this bit about the Latin formula, and you hear this a lot in movies and fiction. There's always got to be some Latin-speaking spirit or demon or the exorcism itself or the exorcist, him or herself, use Latin words. That's not because Latin inherently is some kind of warding off of evil spirits type of language, but because many rituals that date back to the Roman Catholic Church's origins did have, I wouldn't want to call them incantations, but the effect is similar. There are phrases that have been in the Roman Catholic Church for this particular ritual, for this particular rite, really, holy rite, for over 1,000 years. So that's why this pops up. It could really be any language. It could be contemporary language, as long as there is conviction in the delivery and the deliverer is a person that is whole in some sense and genuine. It seems to be what has impact on some supernatural event dissipating, vanishing. And there's many things that we can speculate about that. Was there really anything there, or is just the act of that ceremony of communion with one another, a community coming together, a group of people with conviction saying, no, go away, whatever you are. Even if that is just in our minds, it's a powerful ceremony and a powerful effect, I think. But going back to what was going on at Highgate Cemetery, Manchester says the cemetery officials then bricked up the vault with a crucifix and holy water left inside. But Manchester reflected the vault didn't remain bricked up for long. Ferrand and his group were also making efforts to deal with the strange presence. Meanwhile, they decided to try to communicate it with the entity and discover its purpose. In Highgate Cemetery, they conducted rituals using 2 circles, incense, candles, and a medium. The first time they tried this, the press interrupted them. A whole year later, according to Ferrand, another attempt saw the entity clasping the medium by the throat. We had to break the circle. The area turned cold. She felt she was being enveloped by blackness. She felt something was trying to strangle her. That's Ferrand's quote. Ferrand was now convinced the entity was malignant. After hearing of incidents in which a sinister force had pushed people over in Swain's Lane, he did more research. Ferrand came up with a theory that the being wasn't a vampire at all, but an evil presence that traveled along a ley line. For those of you that don't know what a ley line is, and in fact, myself, this is rather new information, maybe a couple of years old or a few years old when I discovered this phenomena of the ley lines. These are supposed to be natural lines on the earth that are said to be channels whereby spiritual presences are, communicate more easily. That's at least the lore. And back in the day, and I'm talking back in the ancient days, many structures like the Stonehenge and other structures that have very big religious or spiritual impact and influence are said to be constructed along these ley lines, quote unquote. So that's what that is. You can find out a little bit more, and I recommend it because that's a whole subject in and of itself that I'd like to cover down the road. Anyway, this ley line began at the Calambrium, a part of the cemetery where urns are kept, and ran across Highgate through 2 old public houses, Highgate Wood and a block of flats built over a nunnery. Ferrand claimed he found evidence of disturbing supernatural activity in all these places. Some people he spoke to said they'd glimpsed a tall, dark figure, and a manager in one of the pubs apparently saw a sight so horrific it turned his hair white, and one of the flats built over the nunnery had to be exorcised. Despite the ceremony that Manchester and his colleagues conducted in the tomb, any relief was short-lived. Manchester said strange occurrences failed to cease, and more horrifying incidents ended up any hope that we'd quieted the disturbance with a mere spoken exorcism rite. Further vampiric outrages were to follow. Further vampiric outrages. And I like that phrase because it has sort of a dual sense. Is the outrage because the community is becoming hysterical, or is it because it correlates with further incidents that are supernatural and related to this apparition, which is thought to be a vampire? 3 years pass, and then Manchester claims that he and his associates discovered the same ominous black casket in the cellars of an abandoned and suitably Gothic mansion on the borders of Highgate and Crouch End. Manchester suspected the coffin had been moved there to avoid all the attention the media and enthusiastic vampire hunters had focused on Highgate Cemetery. Manchester group dragged the coffin out of the basement, up the stairs, and into the grounds of the mansion. So this was Manchester's group. And they did all of that. They're taking this coffin out of a basement, and I don't know about the legality of all of this. Again, disturbing sacred things, people that have been buried in the ground. It's a very, very, I wouldn't even say unethical. It's patently criminal, and don't do it. But they had a belief in what they were doing. And remember the context of this. This is something that kept people up at night. You remember that bit about that girl who felt that she had traces of a vampire's, injury of where he had fed on her. So these things are starting to manifest. People are worried, and these kind of things tend to relieve that worry. Or do they? Do they just pour fuel into the flames? You decide. Manchester goes on to say Dawn was about to break, starting to send spears of bright illumination onto the macabre spectacle below. When the lid was removed, we beheld the same thing we'd seen in August 1970. This was now the early part of 1974. Our quarry this time looked even more exaggerated, even more distorted than I remembered it, far worse than even that time in the Highgate vault. Its burning, fierce eyes, under the many-furrowed brow, were staring, yellow at the edges with blood-red centers, unlike anything imaginable. The mouth was set in a cruel expression, the lips drawn back. This is a lot to process. This is a very precise description of this apparition believed to be a vampire. And as I keep saying, I found it very hard to find modern-day descriptions of vampires, of sightings of vampires. There's plenty of other sightings, witches, even werewolves, and all kinds of things, but vampires are a rare breed, apparently. What does Manchester do next? Manchester drove a stake into the Highgate Vampire. With a mighty blow, a sharpened shaft of wood impaled the creature's heart. We witnessed the body's shell cave in and quickly turn filthy brown, and that itself soon became a sluggish flow of inhuman slime and viscera in the bottom of the casket. As Manchester believed that cremation is recommended as the ultimate deterrent and preventative to the vampire's nightly wanderings, he and his followers then burned the coffin and what was left of the body. This took several hours, after which all that remained was a great scorch mark and some bones that needed to be ground down and cast to the four corners or four winds of the earth. That last part is Manchester's quote, his words. And we notice, and I want to point out really the different methods that these vampire hunters, these makeshift vampire hunters, draw on either from lore or from some other source, are using to try to get rid of this vampire, this alleged vampire. And they included the incantations, the ceremonies, the rituals, the incense, the medium, in Ferran's case, I believe. And it escalates to this stake being drawn into the coffin, as the other paranormal or vampire hunter claims. He drove a stake right through the coffin, and then the coffin changed. But that seemed not to be good enough. I don't think the only thing that was not done was decapitation, although that is said to be, at least in the lore, it's said to be effective against vampires. And finally, cremation is what Manchester surmised is the ultimate kill-all. There's a lot to that, and there's methodology that's attached to any kind of cryptid or supernatural being, different ways to fight back. To me, that's very interesting, very attractive, because something can be very powerful, very, very powerful, very scary, and pretty much outrun us and outthink us in every which way. But I like the idea that there's a way to combat, to fight back any kind of supernatural attack. Whether there's truth in it or not, I like this idea. I like being able to find some kind of recourse, whether that is ceremony or faith or coming together as a community, which is probably the most recommended thing, and presented a unified front, or whether it is this more esoteric and escalated behavior that you would call violent, but then the person's already dead, so it's just a disturbing of remains, which is really difficult to process. But those are things that I think I would like to highlight. I don't like it when, if you watch a scary movie or hear a scary tale, when it's just always the person running away and having no idea, always just no chance to fight back. But when you stop and you fight back, or you find a way to control your emotions, to do something, to make a stand, whatever it is, it gives it pause. And this is true in the natural world too. Most predators, this is consistent with that, most predators, and by that I mean actual animals that prey on things that are not diabolical, and I hate things that paint them in that picture. They're just following their instinct. We are predators too, and we eat meat, a lot of us. But a lot of predators are always looking out to protect themselves. They have precious things called teeth and paws that don't get to regenerate. If they lose them, that's it. So they're very careful about their attacks. When they attack, first they stalk, and then they find an opening, an opportunity to surprise the prey and run them down and kill them as quickly as possible, depending on the animal. For instance, a lion would be much more a fast killer, or a tiger with just snapping the prey's neck or something like that. A quick way to go. It decreases the chances that as that animal is attacking its prey, that it will in turn get hurt. And like I said, there's just no doctors for them. That's it. You get wounded, and you possibly could die as well in the act of trying to survive. So very interesting things here. There's a bit more to this story because it has repercussions onto how we think about fighting back, or is this a response to hysteria? I think there's a little bit of both here. There's just a lot going on that I wouldn't make up my mind one way or another. I'm just saying. I think there's enough going on here that that points to something very strange happening at this Highgate Cemetery in England. It results years later in how we look at defenses, how we look at even investigations. How should they be carried out? This incident, as you already followed, it spawned a feud that lasted a long, long time between these two, Manchester and Ferrand. Ferrand coming first, Manchester coming later, both claiming they could deal with a vampire. And then, don't forget the crowds. There's even a picture that I found online of, it's a newspaper picture of these youths, these young people, mostly men, just climbing over a fence. It just in that act of, we're gonna, overrun the cemetery. We're gonna catch this thing. It's like hound dogs after a fox. But anyway, so years later, after all of this has happened, Manchester claimed to have destroyed the Highgate Vampire, and his claims did little to end, though, the feud between him and Ferrand. So it didn't end with that. It didn't put a punctuation point on that. There had been rumors that the two would meet in a magician's duel on Parliament Hill on Friday the 13th on April 1973. Can you imagine that? A duel, an actual modern-day duel over this? I mean, it seems to be more about ego at this point and appropriating the story, the legend, what is happening here, than it does to try to help the community. And that is my editorial opinion on it, but it just seems to be it. I wonder what you're thinking. Let me know. But fortunately, this duel never happened. Instead, in 1974, Ferrand was jailed after being convicted of interfering with remains and vandalizing memorials in Highgate Cemetery. There is a price to pay for all of this investigation and all this kinds of really hijinks, and we're learning something here. If you're interested in learning about things like this and interested in pursuing a mystery, you also have to remember that there are boundaries and there's propriety and there is a sense of dignity that you have to give to all of these things that you're doing. Later on, I'm going to think about it. What is it? Is it even ethical to be pursuing a vampire with intent to kill? After all, there were rumors that the vampire wasn't even feeding on people. It wasn't even killing anybody, except for that one girl that claims to have, lost sleep, and then they did a ritual on her. Besides that, it seemed like there were rumors about, animals being fed upon and all that, which seems to me kind of benevolent when you compare it to actual people as prey. So Ferrand asserted that the damage had been caused because he was, in trouble with the law, and he pointed the finger at Satanists. He said Satanists caused it rather than him. But both Ferrand's imprisonment and the rumored duel served to keep the Highgate Vampire in the public mind for several years. Not only several years, now it's been it's got to be 49, 50-something, 53 years or something like that. Half a century. And I think this legend will live on. It's not a legend, really, because it did really happen. So, the quarrel between Ferrand and Manchester dragged on for decades, with each claiming to be an expert exorcist while dismissing the other's abilities. Both spent many years investigating paranormal phenomena, and both produced books, articles, and websites, and gave many interviews. One of those I shared with you, that terrible footage. Sorry about that, but that's the best that we could do. It's really old, but that was one of them. And they were all about the Highgate Vampire. It's becoming a bit of a franchise, this Highgate Vampire, and each one of these two wants to really own it, own the story. The two men and their followers, because now there's two groups that are adamant that one has the right way and the other one doesn't. It's almost like two sects, like heretics. Frequently sparred on social media. David Ferrand died aged 73 in April 2019. But Manchester still works, as of the writing of this and the research of this podcast, as an exorcist and bishop in the British Old Catholic Church. A conservative sect that broke away from Roman Catholicism. Another interesting thing, because remember the rites are very Roman that I mentioned, and there are not just one Roman Catholic church, which is what most of us know. There is also an American Catholic Church. These are not cultic religions. They just separated from the Roman Catholic Church while preserving many of the rites and traditions. They just don't agree with certain things. It could be marriage, like the celibacy of priests, or it could be something to do with the Pope, most likely. But they are carrying on the tradition, having separated. They're not very big, but they're here in the U.S. and apparently also in England, because it's the first time I ever heard about the British Old Catholic Church. After slaying the Highgate Vampire, Manchester maintains he has destroyed dozens of bloodsuckers. I should say that again. So, not only did he claim, Manchester, to have dealt with the Highgate Vampire, but after that, he goes on for a long time. So I'm going to focus on that on the second part of this podcast, because we go quite a bit at length with this one, and it needs to be that way because there's just so much, and it's a precious gem of an account. But I want to go into the methodology, the origin, the impetus of what could be considered modern-day vampire hunters in part 2. I want to talk, though, about one of those incidents apparently involved in a secondary contagion from the Highgate Vampire in Finchley's Great Northern London Cemetery in 1982. A bite from that infamous Nosferatu had corrupted the body of a woman called Lucia. Arriving at the cemetery, Manchester saw a spider-like creature about the size of a cat. He stalked it and felt sure he'd put an end to the pollution of the Highgate Vampire for good. But has the Highgate Vampire, or whatever it is, really been laid to rest? Ferrand thought not, and ominously a number of sightings of tall, dark figures with burning eyes have occurred from the 1990s until the present day. One witness, who claimed to have glimpsed the spook in 1991, said he was very tall, well over 6 feet in height, and very thin. I like this account because a 7-foot tall vampire, just, I don't know, that seems quite a stretch. But it could be, like I said, or like I speculated, if it's something that's an apparition, it's trying to ward off something, maybe it's making itself look bigger, just like a cat does, But the description goes on. He says to have, he wore a long black cape, light cloak, and a top hat. His dress looked Victorian in style, and he appeared all in black. He also appeared to glide, and there was no sound. The ground was littered with leaves, yet I heard no sound from him. It's amazing. So another account of the vampire, or of a vampire-like figure, and the way he's dressed seems to fit. Imagine if you're a vampire and you don't really you live a long, long time. I mean, how many of us are still stuck wearing whatever it is, the fashion that, that we liked at some point, and just haven't realized that things have changed, and people don't wear bell bottoms, or people don't wear, dyed jeans or whatever it is that the fashion was, So they seem to stay stuck. I like that detail. It's interesting. I want to point us to whether there's any rational explanation of this Highgate Vampire. Because as colorful and dramatic as the accounts of Ferrand are, and especially Manchester's accounts, his vampire fighting, and it's much more vivid. You got to remember, Ferrand doesn't really go to all these lengths that Manchester does, and he's really outdoing him in the fighting of it all, the fighting of the vampire, that is. There's quite a few of those even at that time that were going to have a skeptical mind, and who would feel tempted to question the Highgate Vampire narrative. Are there any explanations, social, cultural, or psychological, that would account for the hysteria and bizarre events afflicting North London in 1960s and 1970s? The Highgate Vampire was a strange case, but below, I want to go on are some attempts to rationally understand the phenomenon. One of them has to do with a phenomenon called legend tripping, and by phenomenon I mean more of a fad, more of a youth-driven dare type of thing. Legend tripping is a term used by folklorists and anthropologists to describe a common pattern of behavior in which groups of young people make expeditions to sites associated with horrific, tragic, and supernatural events. Pretty much the premise of a lot of horror movies, with teenagers daring to, hey, go to the old haunted house, break some windows, and then it just starts a whole thing. So these visits, which normally take place at night, can be seen as rites of passage which enable the youngsters to demonstrate their courage and daring. And in a modern world where we don't have a rite of passage from youth to adulthood, that makes sense, especially for males, I think. The sites of such legend trips can include caves, tunnels, abandoned buildings, and especially cemeteries. While most examples of legend tripping are relatively harmless, some expeditions may involve trespassing, vandalism, and even occult rituals. Both Ferrand's and Manchester's entourages were groups of young people led by charismatic young men, and their escapades did definitely tend towards the ritualistic. And these two groups were not the only ones engaged in legend tripping. There were also the hundreds of other vampire hunters and those practicing the black arts. Might one bunch of legend trippers have been in competition with Manchester's groups, hiding the vampiric corpse and doing their best to thwart Manchester's attempts to track it down? I mean, you have to speculate about all kinds of competitions. I mean, we just highlighted two main opposing branches or factions of vampire hunters embodied by David Ferrand. To me, he seems a little bit more, I don't know if the word is honest, but at least a little bit more circumvent or less, just less in your face about his methods of approaching this vampire at Highgate Cemetery than Manchester does with his almost Hollywood-like gung-ho methods, which I think are just fascinating. A related phenomenon to legend tripping is called ostentation, which refers to the literal acting out of well-known legends and lore. Such acting out can become a kind of game in which the borders of fantasy and reality get blurred. And do you remember I talked a little bit about that role-playing game based on the original TV series? Actually, not based on the TV series. The TV series is based on this role-playing game that also spawned the Kindred, the Embraced, failed or canceled show of the late 90s. So there is a bit of that in role-playing. There's at least that dimension of course, the forum and the method is so much more different with entertainment and communion and sharing and living this sort of dark fantasy. But here, it could also be cause for a much more overt way of acting all this stuff out. We humans, it's my opinion, I guess, that when we encounter something truly scary, we do tend to appropriate some of it, act it out, absorb it, consume it, try to understand it that way. Bite into it and see what it does. I mean, that's what Halloween is all about, isn't it? We dress up for one night and act crazy. But it's been noted by many that Highgate Vampire Saga bears strong resemblances to Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. In Dracula, as many of us know, the Count mostly attacks young women and likewise young men. But Manchester claimed were those the Highgate Vampire chiefly pestered were women. Bram Stoker's novel also includes sleepwalking victims, coffined vampires being discovered in putrid vaults, and the use of crucifixes, garlic, and holy water to repel such monsters. Other similarities are the vampire's Eastern European origins, his purchase of a fashionable house in the West End, and his red, burning eyes. The Highgate area itself features in Dracula, as it's where the aristocrat-made vampire Lucy Westerna is entombed. The neo-Gothic mansion is a reasonable stand-in for Dracula's spooky castle, and the Count, like the Highgate Vampire, is finally dispatched by a stake through the heart. I want to pause and reorient us about this part that I just shared. And while there are a lot of parallels, at least cursory parallels, it also does make sense because Dracula itself was not just drawn up out of nowhere. It comes from lore. It comes from the old Eastern European lore, and much of the vampire lore is centered in Eastern Europe. The word Dracula itself, the word vampire itself, is said or believed to be of Slavic origin. There's also some Greek possibilities there, northern Greece. All of that is not even that far from Eastern Europe. And of course, we talked about even more ancient beginnings. The fact that those things match doesn't mean that what was going on there is suspiciously like an acting out of the novel and the tropes in the novel and so on. It could very well be that that's what a modern sighting looks like, that it even, I would say, corroborates some of this lore, if you believe that this account is true. We can also make a little bit of parallel that the name Lucy and Lucia, which came in one of the accounts in the secondary infestation of the Great Northern London Cemetery, is connected to this story. We can go on with this and trying to pick similarities between the book and what happened at Highgate, but Highgate was a real event. These things manifested, whether they were caused by the forces of some apparition, a real vampire, people imagining things, people out of fear and panic, starting to build these two other vampire hunters, Manchester and Ferrand, fanning the flames. It did still happen. There was an event. It's a historical fact. So whatever happened, and if it happens to fit with the lore, I think that we can't discount it. We might even look more deeply into this. When questioned, though, Manchester did downplay the similarities of his vampire hunting to works of literature, stating that I certainly haven't encountered anything that can be described as a Byronic figure from a Gothic romance. That tradition in fiction has a lot of Byronic input, largely due to John William Polidori's novel The Vampire. But no, the eyeless sockets of impenetrable darkness I've encountered bear no relation to the glamorized image. A little bit of separation, he's just, standing his ground, and I think that I can respect that. Just because it's a novel doesn't mean that it wasn't also part of the sighting. Still, it would seem that much of the Highgate Vampire mythos may well have been molded by the propensities of local youngsters for legend-tripping and ostentation. That's not my opinion. I'm sharing the opinion of some of the people that looked into it. I don't think that is the origin. I really don't. I just looked into so many different angles. You could say that life imitates art and then art imitates life again, but it's worth pointing out that the popular culture at the time was awash with vampire images. And we have scores of 1970s movies and lore, and studios were creating, lots of things. But I don't know about the 1970s, but it was between 1950 and 1970, there were a lot of movies. And the one that comes to mind about the Nosferatu was the first silent movie made about that, which I think is just a masterpiece. You gotta watch that. In the aftermath of all of this Highgate drama, numerous TV programs and comics also featured vampires before and after, and it just becomes part of the collective consciousness. And there's something to that too. I want to think about a little bit about that angle, whether a collective consciousness, is there anything to it? Can it make something rise out of nothing? Can we see things that we wouldn't have seen because we are culturally bound to? But again, I am hesitant to take that direction. I want to share that angle, but I don't think that someone who may be aware of vampires all of a sudden is just going to say, I saw a vampire, it's in Highgate Cemetery, and it looks like this. I just don't see that most people are going to be jumping from one thing that may be in the back of their mind because they were exposed to the lore of vampires, and all of a sudden there's claim to see them. If that were true, then I should have found a lot more accounts than I did in my research. And you can try that too. If you find something, let me know. But I did not find a lot that was credible. I was even hoping to find things that were just way out there, because there are people that will say whatever, and to try to dismantle what new or modern accounts were, but there weren't any, hardly any, really. You could say that people who have some mental disease might think that they're a vampire, but to see real proof of it, kind of like in Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, where somebody's interviewing a vampire and then boom, you really know that they really are one. We don't see that coming through that much. You could say also that there's a kind of a shared social anxiety. We live in an age, and when have we not lived in an age of social anxiety, I want to know. But we can say that we live in an age of social anxiety, and vampire legends, they seem to be associated with times of social upheaval and change. And published in the dying years of the Victorian era, Bram Stoker's novel has ancient folklore running up against innovations like railways, telegrams, phonographs. The exotic immigrant figure of the Count embodies fears linked to colonialism, immigration, globalization, with frequent references to new women, revealing anxieties about the emerging feminist movement and changing gender roles. The eroticism of the vampire could be connected to the fact that Victorian sexual mores were just starting to loosen. This is interesting from the fictional aspect side of all of it. Could this have seeped into the story of the vampire? Definitely, I think, fictionalizations are going to absorb that. Writers are not immune. Writers, and I'm one of them, absorb things in many different ways, experience things in many different ways, and yet I still don't think that just because we are exposed to stories, all of a sudden we're spotting a chubby guy down the street wearing red and calling him Santa Claus. There's a big leap from one to the other. And you could look at the background of the 1970s. It was still the Cold War. It was riding they wouldn't know, but it was going to last up until 1986 or something like that. Or 1989, pardon me, something like that, when the communism fell down. But we're still under the threat of if any of you were children or grew up in that age, what it felt like to be under the nuclear gun. Could all of that have spawned some anxiety, some deep-seated anxiety about death, and sort of channeled it into visions of the vampire? I think some might say that that's a stretch, but it's death, carnage, murder, ugly images of dead bodies. All of this stuff is happening in the backdrop of wars that were happening at the time. Vietnam. Humans can be far more horrific than one tiny little apparition in one cemetery. Think about the scale of what we can do compared to what we say exists out there. And if they do exist, and this is something that I'll elaborate more in part 2, what is it that drives our fear to go to these extents, to go to a mob mentality? Why can't we try to understand the vampire? Is there something to that? And I'm going to introduce you to some accounts of vampire hunters, modern-day vampire hunters, which I'm very interested in, and also some of these real vampire, when I say real, quote-unquote real, they're not the real supernatural beings nor claiming to be, but they're subculture societies that have formed in places like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, not surprisingly, who make it part of their lives, this vampiric sort of lifestyle, farther than the quote-unquote ostentation or the playing acting or the role-playing games or any of that. These people really do engage in that lifestyle, and they do it in a way that's very ritualized and very secret and very discreet, and I want to be tasteful about how I cover them, because I don't want to point a finger and laugh. That's not what this is about, or point a finger and say how weird. I want to be respectful of their point of view. I don't want to cover this in part 1 because part 2 is going to look into more of this research about the vampiric societies and subcultures, and yet that's still not something I'm going to go as deep as you might think, because my angle is going to be, if you're a vampire and you know what humanity is like, and you live even 100 years, but say you lived hundreds of years, what methods would you deploy to survive? What techniques would you draw on? What insight do you have into humanity? I would love to interview a vampire, not for just the questions about, well, where do you sleep? Sleep in a coffin? What kind of clothes do you wear? Do you have big red eyes? All of that. But also to gain the insight of a true alien, an entity that would see us in a very different light, or in a very different type of shadow light. And who's afraid of whom in that scenario? It seems like vampires are more afraid of humanity, as many predators are in the animal world, than we are of them. So I leave you with that thought. In a little bit more, I'm going to share a couple of more legends at the start of part 2, but I want you to think about the role of humanity in relation to the vampire, where we can speculate about vampirism. We don't have to wonder about the extents and the actionable steps that we take to defend ourselves as human beings when faced with paranormal forces. That's going to wrap up this episode of Urban Vampires. Do modern vampires lurk in modern cities? We're going to keep the campfire going here at the Phenomena Case Files podcast. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into a few more accounts of urban vampires. We'll peek into modern underground vampire subcultures and shed some light into the methods of old and modern day vampire hunters. Meantime, share, subscribe, and spread the word to friends and kindred spirits. And if you should find yourself walking through a dark alley between high rises and you feel the burn of glowing eyes on you, look up. You might just have sighted a modern city vampire.